Alrighty, so welcome everyone. I've joked earlier that probably the fascination and the reason everyone's coming to this program is because you want to figure out how the heck is she going to do this and keep her job? How do you talk about exploitation at a public library? Well, we're going to figure this out. So buckle up. We're in for a ride. Just a warning before we start, as much as I've joked about, how much can I talk about and still keep my job? I genuinely do not want anyone to feel uncomfortable or unsafe. So I am just going to give one more warning that we are going to be covering controversial content. It's not going to be too explicit, but there are some, parts of exploitation that deal with crimes and violence. So if this is not your thing, or if you just decide I'd like to leave, I perfectly understand. If I do talk about anything too awful, I am going to try to give warnings, especially if I describe something that is particularly gruesome. So you could, mute or leave the room if you'd like to. So again, I would like to make this there is the term NSFW, not safe for work. I would like to make this a safe for work program. And as usual, I do have to get at least one Simpsons reference in through here. So just a quick start, how did I get into, a nice girl like this get into exploitation? I think it started when I was young, because I was around for the time of independent video stores, where you would see video boxes of stuff like Lucio Fulci's Zombie, John Waters' Pink Flamingos, and Peter Jackson's Dead Alive or Brain Dead. That's right, everybody. Before he won an Oscar, Peter Jackson directed some pretty gory splatter films. And I immediately kind of had an interest in them. I wanted to see them. And my parents, being good parents, were like, oh, heck no, you're not. But they kind of stayed with me. And it was that sort of like, I'll revisit you later someday. So when I got into college and started taking film courses, this stuff starts to come up when I start, we're discussing stuff like Straw Dogs, and start reading into it. I also started at that time kind of getting into the idea of forbidden cinema or controversial films. That's kind of how I found my way there. I was also getting well into finding out what I liked in horror. So I eventually ended up kind of in the Italian horror / Italian ripoff end of exploitation. But curious cinephile that I am, I watched a few more. And it has always remained a curiosity for me, mainly because the more I've studied film and watched film, the more I realized this stuff that started off as like, cautionary tales, we now can see the influences in our modern day films. So we're just going to start with a little bit of true or false. So exploitation films are filled with violence and sex. False. Exploitation films can cover a wide variety of things. There's hippie movies, there's biker movies, there are sex and violence, but there's also stuff like martial arts films, there's Italian crime movies. It's a much wider, it's much wider genre than people would give it credit for. Actually, really, I just made a mistake. Exploitation is a genre, and that's a false-ish. So the one thing I would really like to hammer home here is that exploitation is a very broad term for film. And we'll get into that when we get into the definitions. Some people see it more as a style of filmmaking. Other people consider it to be a genre with, a huge umbrella with a lot of subgenres under it. Some people think that there's hallmarks of exploitation that you can find in any film, mainstream or not. Exploitation is made by directors for hire. False. A lot of the people who started out in it, people like John Waters, Russ Meyer, Bruno Mattei, they loved working on it because they didn't have to deal with studios. They kind of did their own thing and they didn't have to answer to anybody. However, there were plenty of directors who were like, look, this is my job and this is what I'm doing. Exploitation hasn't contributed anything to cinema. Well, by the time we're done with this, I hope you think that's wrong. The final one, exploitation is degrading to women. Yeah, we're gonna get to that one. That's a That's complicated. All right, so what is exploitation? I have both a simple definition and a more complicated one. And obviously, can't read the complicated one in full. The simple definition is it is a film intended to attract an audience by means of sensationalist or controversial content. And this is something that films have done since films were invented. And this is something that art has done. If you look back at some older paintings, older books, sensationalism and controversy has always been a way to sell something. Complicated definition, and this is from David Roche, which is Exploiting Exploitation Cinema. Exploitation cinema is not a genre. It is an industry with a specific mode of production. Exploitation films are made cheap for easy profit. Easy because they are almost always genre films relying on time-tired formulas. So horrors, thrillers, biker movies. And they're easy because they offer the audience something they can't get anywhere else. Sex, violence, and the taboo topics. So this is, I kind of think that it's a mixture of the two, if you were to ask me personally, because with exploitation, especially in like the 50s, 60s, 70s into the 80s, there is definitely, it really falls into that mode of production, meaning it's cheap, it's quickly printed, and it's out the door to a grindhouse theater for everyone to view. But as we go into the 90s and beyond, this more simplified definition seems to be the better one to go with. So, speaking of subgenres of exploitation, there's a lot there, and this isn't even a complete list. So, blaxploitation is probably a term most of you have heard. That was very popular in the 70s, stuff like Shaft, Dolomite, a lot of Black creators got their start in exploitation. Sexploitation in nudist films, that is really what kind of kicked the door down for a lot of exploitation cinema. And not entirely, because a lot of pre-code films did have nudity in it, but I think we can look at sex and cinema post-code. Those nudity films really did kind of help usher that back into being acceptable. There's nunsploitation, which is exactly what it says on the tin. Notsploitation, exactly what it says on the tin. And if I may editorialize, that's poor taste, even for me. Women in prison films, Jonathan Demme, acclaimed director Jonathan Demme got to start making women in prison films. Mondo, which are these pseudo documentaries usually focusing on, you know, quote unquote weird foreign rituals. There's the rape revenge genre, which another, exactly what it says on the tin, a violated woman goes on revenge against her attackers. I Spit on Your Grave is probably the most famous example of that. Biker films, splatter films, slasher movies. The Macaroni Combat, I just love that title. That's Italian war movies. If you are a fan of Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, the original one, The Inglourious Bastards, is a Macaroni Combat film. And Shambara films, if you've ever seen the Lone Wolf and Cub series from the 70s, those are bloody samurai movies. Those are a lot of fun. And cannibal films, which we'll get into that. Again, I'll just warn you, if you're not into that discussion, discretion is advised. So early exploitation. This is the 20s and 40s. So this focused on the cautionary tales rather than the bad behavior. It really was kind of one of those things where it was a very, as TV tropes would put it, do not do this cool thing. So it was definitely a look at, the marijuana sent this poor girl down a life of crime and prostitution, but it also kind of glamorized smoking marijuana. Probably the most famous exploitation / anti-drug film of this time is 1938's Reefer Madness. That's probably, if you've heard of any film from that time, it's that movie. And it's also the movie that kind of helped, at least for the masses, demonize marijuana. There were also very early women in prison film, which is Girls on Probation, although a lot of the women in prison films of the time focused more on the lam crime aspect and not prison. There was stuff about child marriage. Test Tube Babies, which was 1948, dealt with artificial insemination. And I do love the name of this one. She Should Have Said No, which is about drugs. So if you were a child of the 90s and you remember a lot of the anti-drug commercials, think of a lot of these movies as just full-length versions of that. And you've kind of got that. But especially once the Hays Code set in, this was kind of one of the few ways you could see bad behavior on the big screen. But it had to be moralistic and tell you, don't do it. So the movie I want to highlight is Todd Browning's Freaks, which I think is a great film. If you've never seen it, I highly recommend it. Todd, is this a free and full on YouTube because there's no rights, or?
Let me double check on that actually. One sec.
Okay, I'll keep talking. This is a film, and we'll talk about a few more of these, where it really toes the line between exploitation and a more legitimate feature. So it's about a trapeze artist trying to swindle a wealthy dwarf who works in a circus. How this dwarf has so much money, I don't know. Good for him. This starred real circus performers and people with physical disabilities. And you have to remember, at the time, the circus, a lot of people who had deformities or just genetic abnormalities, like women who were here student had beards. The traveling circus was where you could go to potentially make a living, because differences weren't as accepted back then as they are now. So when it premiered, the reaction to it was very visceral. One woman claimed that it made her miscarry, and people were horrified by it. And partially, the ending is very shocking. I will not spoil it if you haven't seen it, but there were a lot of people who were genuinely shocked to see people with these deformities, which you normally didn't see on screen, or in some cases just in public at all. This was also the age where if someone had a mental disability, they were usually shut up in asylums. So you could argue that by centering the story around and giving screen time to these people, that Todd Browning was looking to be controversial and to exploit what he knew would be a fairly visceral reaction to this. I would say Freaks goes a little bit more, I would put it more into the non-exploitation genre, but it's definitely one where it's like that line is being blurred.
To kind of actually bait the hook a little bit further, that will technically also fall under, you can't see this on because the complete cut of that movie is probably lost to the ages.
Oh, that's right. Oh.
Also, I looked, officially it does not look like it's up on YouTube, but it might be up on archive.org, so.
Yep. By the way, if you ever want to try to see some out-of-print movies that are technically public domain, archive.org is a wonderful, wonderful site. So this is our first member of the Exploitation Hall of Fame. So you cannot talk about B movies, midnight movies, exploitation movies without talking about Roger Corman. There is a whole industry of film that would not exist if not for him. He is the father of the B movie. He perfected the production of low budget features. He's not, I would say, an incredibly artistic director. He was the very shoot it cheap, make it quick, get it in the can for it to get to a theater. But the man was I hope still is, I hope I haven't jinxed him, is an innovative person. And he also helped launch the careers of people like Jack Nicholson, Coppola, Scorsese, Bogdanovich, Jonathan Demme. He founded New World Pictures in 1970, which, if you want a fun time, New World Pictures, if I may quote one of my favorite film podcasts, We Hate Movies, they just say, New World Pictures, that logo should just say, you're in for a treat. His autobiography, I love the title of that, made 100 movies in Hollywood, never lost a dime. I mean, you can't talk about exploitation, especially when we're talking about exploitation as the means of production that's sort of quick and cheap, without talking about him. Oops, gotta go back. Oh, Todd, looks like someone's in the chat. Sorry. So his final film directorially was Frankenstein Unbound, but he continues to produce, and this is just as of right now. I checked today because Lord knows if that might change. He has 416 producer credits. And he was actually, I'll say, in like the 60s and 70s, one of the few directors willing to give women a chance to work on his pictures and direct. Stephanie Rothman, who directed The Student Nurses, is a good example. She started out as an assistant to him, and he just said, hey, do you want to direct this feature? And this was at a time where mainstream Hollywood really wasn't letting that happen. So this is, one where I would say, hey, exploitation films may be cheap and their movies may not be the most feminist, but some of the people working it were a bit more forward thinking and trusting of women to direct a feature than the bigwigs in Hollywood.
Since
So
you
we're
brought up
on. Oh, yep. What?
Since you pointed out the chat there, Tony just wanted to affirm that that Corman biography is a must read.
Absolutely. So the 60s, the 50s to the early 60s, we start to see the rise of biker movies. The troubled teen movies come in. The biker movies and the troubled teens are kind of, I would say, this is just sort of the through line from those cautionary tale movies. Those cautionary tale movies from the early Hollywood definitely usually dealt with like younger people. It's like, oh, that young Jimmy ruined his life by smoking that marijuana. And so now we have, stuff like Girls Town starring Mamie Van Doren, High School Hellcats. I should also add, if you're a fan of Mystery Science Theater, you've probably seen at least some of these movies. So with the 50s, we see the rise of the B movies, the midnight room movies. Roger Corman just comes in and helps change Hollywood. We also had producer George Weiss, who was challenging the production code as far back as the 40s, and he produces in 1953 Glenn or Glenda, which is Edward's movie, which deals with cross-dressing. It says transvestitism and sex reassignment surgery. If we were to use the terminology now, it'd probably be, oh, it's a film about a transgender woman. And this was partially inspired by, I hope I'm saying the name correctly, Christine Borgendale. She was an American GI who very famously transitioned post-war. And again, this was 1953, so there goes that idea of this is a newfangled thing. But it definitely kind of reveled more in the shock value of like, oh my goodness, rather than just something more matter of fact. So we see, again, less cautionary tales, morality plays, more gang movies. We have a lot of delinquent biker films. So bad, so young and so bad. This is sort of we start to see where women in prison films are going, because it's not just Girls on the Lam now. Spends a little more time with women in prison. And we also had the more, like, I would say, produced films like Rebel Without a Cause and Blackboard Jungle. So the stuff like High School Hellcats and Girls Town, these were the counterparts. So the more pulpy versions of the Oscar-nominated James Dean movies. So once again, I would say arguably the most important film to come out that decade is The Immortal Mr. Tease, because this broke ground. It's not only the debut of Russ Meyer, but it's the first major nudie film. So while there is nudity, there's no sex. And this, along with nudist camp movies, which we're going to get to what nudist camp movies were and how nudist camp movies escaped censors, this did help pave the way for modern nudity in film. And with that, we're going to get to my man, Russ Meyer. And I had to pick the picture of him with his, I think, then wife, Edie Williams, who plays Ashley St. Ives in Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. I think he's called himself King of the Nudies, and I would absolutely give him that title. So he made his debut, like a lot of directors, short films. He did the nudie cuties like Mr. Tease, and he had a very specific body type of women that he liked. He liked curvy women. He, if we're going to quote, as Sir Mix-a-Lot said, he liked the women with a lot of back. But he had a good sense of humor. He liked satire. I think he really owned, like, if you've, like, I think he wrote his own biography, but if you've read other people who've written about him, Roger Ebert's written about him. There's a biography. It's Square Jaws and Big Bosoms. He kind of owned the fact that he's like, yeah, I like what I like. And I have watched his movies. I never find anything super creepy about it. If anything, there is a reverence in a way for the women he puts on screen. Like, he sees, like, if you've ever seen Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, the main woman in that, I'm blanking on her name, it was Tula. Oh, I'm going to kick myself for this, but she's the brunette. He sees her and films her like she is this powerful Amazon, rather than something more leering and objectifying, which we are going to see as sexploitation goes forward. Speaking of Roger Ebert, he was good friends with Roger, and they both wrote the script for Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, it's a satirical film first and foremost, but it's also an exploitation film in two ways. It's an exploitation film in that it is satirizing the old morality tale exploitation films. It's a little have its cake and eat it too. It's satirizing it, but it's also kind of giving you what you get from those. But it's also, there is a scene towards the end or chain of events, which was, I'm just going to say this here, not in great taste, inspired by the Charles Manson killings. So, I mean, even back, back then, less than a year after it happened, they're like, oh, let's utilize this awful thing that happened for our satire film. Thankfully, there's enough of a difference in terms of what happened in there that it doesn't mar the movie, but it's still one when I learned that I was like, oh, that's not great taste. So I did love this quote from Ebert about Vixen. It's the best film to date that is a uniquely American genre, the skin flick. And also, kind of going back to his humor, he never really showed too much nudity in his movies or nothing really extreme or graphic. Once he saw that sexploitation was really turning towards like basically pornography or stuff that was more hardcore, he retired. He's like, that's it. This isn't what I want to do, and I'm going to pack up my bags. And I would say, like, the two movies I would definitely recommend seeking out, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is it's trash treasure, and Faster Pussycat Kill Kill is a fun movie to watch. Speaking of sexploitation, we are now in the 60s. So Doris Wishman, probably the most prominent woman in exploitation, she makes her debut in Hideout in the Sun, which is set at a nudist camp. So a lot of nude films, or the first nudies, they were set at nudist colonies. And the reason they would do that is because they were technically deemed educational, or they said they were educational, and therefore they got past censors. People figured, oh, that's fine. I mean, I don't know how, but kudos on them for that ingenuity. And they were also, again, a lot more cheeky and fun. They had titles like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and much, like the Russ Meyer films, really no actual sex. And I should also note the 60s, we had foreign films starting to come in. I Am Curious Yellow, which that caused a stir when it premiered here. But the mid 60s, we transfer from kind of the cheeky fun of the nudies to the roughies. And this is where we get more, I would say, less savory ideas. So there's usually violence, kidnapping. Sometimes it would just be a more frank depiction of sexuality. So there's stuff like Lorna by Russ Meyer, Scum of the Earth, Bad Girls Go to Hell by Doris Wishman, Body of a Female, which was Mike Findlay. But yeah, this is where, I mean, because especially in Europe, it's like, okay, we can show the nude body on screen. Where do we go from here? And when you continuously have this idea of you need to keep pushing the envelope, unfortunately, the envelope can go to somewhere where it's like, okay, this isn't as fun to watch anymore. So these sexploitation films, they not only attracted controversy, but people who viewed them were considered perverts. So if you've ever wondered where the guy in a raincoat with the sunglasses in the newspaper in front of his face going into a theater came from, it kind of came from this, because people did not want to be seen viewing these. So just a couple of other notable sexploitation films. So Nude on the Moon is Doris Wishman. This isn't quite sexploitation. It was the 60s and I wanted to put it in here. This is a short documentary called Queens at Heart, which is about transgender women. So on one hand, very groundbreaking because it's showing them as they are and as they live. However, the documentary focuses mostly on the medical part of transition, and a lot of people now kind of consider that to be exploitative. Russ Meyer's Vixen comes out in 1968. Inga, directed by Joe Sarno, is one of the first X-rated movies released in the US and is produced by Canon, which we're going to get there. Other countries start to direct exploitation films as well. Fuego in 1969 and 99 Women. These are just a couple of other notable people who got their start in sexploitation. So Stephanie Rothman, as I mentioned, Joe D'Amato. Joe D'Amato had a very varied career, as did Rothman. If there's one thing I've learned about people who worked in exploitation, they kind of moved around a bit. They didn't usually stay in one genre. I did like this quote from David F. Friedman. I've made some terrible pictures, but I won't make apologies for anything I've ever done. Nobody ever asked for their money back. Speaking of Doris Wishman, the mother of the nudie, and as I said, probably the most powerful woman, definitely in the 60s exploitation industry. And in terms of groundbreaking, she is someone who I think hasn't gotten her due, mainly because of what she worked in. She got her start as an actress. That didn't really work out, but she worked as a film booker for her cousin who handled exploitation films. And that's how she got into, like, I can make some of these. She moved on to Ruffies, and she started doing more soft core films in the 1970s. She worked with Annie Sprinkle for Satan Was a Lady. And she kind of fell off in the 1980s, but in the 90s, her work kind of started to get a following, to the point where she was a guest on Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and Roger Ebert, who had reviewed some of her films, was a guest as well. I almost wanted to include this as a video clip, but the tape transfer for it is really not great. But if you want to seek it out, it's a fun little conversation. And it shows that even she passed away in the early aughts, that even up until her death, she was still feisty and had a point of view. And of all the interviews I've read about people who knew her, that's what they'd say. They're like, you couldn't cross her. She had her point of view, and she was someone to be reckoned with. So another big thing started to happen in the 60s, and this is more my field. Gore started to become a thing. Not as, it isn't as if violence had never happened in films before, but we didn't have the level of gore that we had. Well, I guess I should say now. Now it's almost something that it doesn't faze us because we see it so much. But in the 1960s, when the stuff starts to happen, it is groundbreaking. So Hammer films, they pushed the level for violence even back in the 1950s. One of the first I would consider gore pictures is a 1960 Japanese film called Jigoku, and that features a trip through Buddhist hell, but there you see graphic depictions of punishments. And that's Criterion Collection does have it, but I believe it's almost out of print at this point. 1962, Mondo Kane makes its debut, and this is, again, one of those just like big moments in exploitation. This is a faux documentary, mockumentary. There's always been debate as to whether or not the footage in it is real, how much is real, but it's a collection of shocking rituals across the globe, definitely exoticizing other cultures, and also has scenes of animal violence. So if you don't like seeing that, I definitely would not recommend seeking this out. Also, 1968, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead comes out, and while I don't think that would qualify as an exploitation film, it definitely pushed boundaries in terms of what can be shown on film. So this, if you have not seen Night of the Living Dead, it's in black and white. But George did what he could to, depict people eating the bodies of other human beings. Granted, it was cooked meat and Hershey's syrup because that's what showed up on camera. Really not sure how no one got sick on that set. They probably did. But I mean, again, this was something people hadn't seen before and were actually really terrified when it came out. But the Godfather of Gore made his debut. He wasn't his debut, but made his mark in 1963 with Blood Feast. So this is directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis. Gore would probably not be anywhere near as accepted now if not for him. So if you don't like gore, blame this guy. But this is the first, Blood Feast is the first film to feature really realistic gore effects, gore makeup, and, touches on the taboo of cannibalism. And he follows it up with 2000 Maniac. So if you're looking at the still there, imagine being in 1963 and seeing that on screen. I mean, he's someone who worked with prop limbs, prop bodies. He figured out what makes for realistic fake blood. And funnily enough, he wasn't a guy who was super devoted to gore, to horror as a genre. He was actually pretty kind of a journeyman. So again, Godfather of Gore, John Waters has spoken the man's praises. He got to start working in teen delinquent films. He worked in nudie pictures, and he switched to horror, which is where he made his big impact with the double whammy of Blood Feast in 2000 Maniacs. But after, he did horror, he then went into the morality style movies. There was one called The Girl, the Body, and the Pill in 1967. Remember, 1966 is when the pill becomes nationwide news. He also made a sexploitation western, which I kind of want to watch because I'm like, all right, how's this going to work out? And after another going back to horror again, he just retired from filmmaking, became a copywriter in the 70s, and just lived out the rest of his days. They're having documentaries made about them. He's more than happy to be interviewed. Just kind of was like, yeah, he knew when to fold them, but his impact, like, you can't look at any gory film made in the United States and not go, well, Herschel Gordon Lewis made this possible. So just a quick sort of little side stop, grindhouse and exploitation. I've used the term grindhouse a few times, and sometimes people will call certain movies grindhouse movies. Just want to make a clarification. Grindhouse films, that means the type of theater they are shown in, not the style of film. The reason the confusion happens is because a lot of exploitation movies were shown in grindhouse theaters, so people would just call them, grindhouse films. These theaters, they used to show low budget, sleazy pictures. And before film, they were sometimes be places where burlesque shows were performed. So they were always kind of associated with sort of the dregs of entertainment, very low art. And in the 60s and 70s, these were the places where you could see exploitation films or some of those nudie films or the roughies. Again, go in with your raincoat and sunglasses and newspaper. And this really just happened with a lot of films or theaters in general. Was once VHS came about, once we had HBO and cable, a lot of these theaters, since they weren't a part of a chain, they were local, they ended up closing and going under. So support your local theater if it still exists, people. So just quick before we go into the 70s, I would like to highlight what I would call an exploitation power couple. These are the Findlays. So it's Michael Findlay, so he would write and direct, and Roberta, his wife, would either co-write, she would act, she would serve as a cinematographer. They came on the scene in the mid 60s, so they did the Roughies. But the one that really put Michael Findlay on the map was Snuff. So this Snuff is a fairly infamous film. You might have heard of it. It was the one that in the 70s was advertised as a real person is killed on screen. Was the subject of a lot of protests from a number of people, from the morality police to feminists. Saw this as this is the end result of normalizing violence against women. Obviously, no one was killed on screen. Just think about it for 2 seconds. Would a major picture be released if a person was intentionally murdered on screen? Not really, especially if it was a studio. Unfortunately, Michael was killed in 1977 in a helicopter accident, but Roberta continued to work. She made hardcore films. She made horror. I think she ran a record store for a bit. She was someone who just kind of was, again, open for interviews. And she's got a lot of fun stories, including nearly getting arrested filming a number of times. But again, just kind of, it sort of goes against this idea that all the people making these exploitation movies are these creepy old men, where we have Doris Wishman and we have a husband and wife couple. On to the 70s, where exploitation evolved and, in my opinion, truly became a lot more fun. Whoops, got to go back. 1971, Ken Russell's The Devils is released. I would not consider this an exploitation film. I actually think it is one of the best films a lot of people haven't seen. But if you watch that movie, it is very clearly got some nunsploitation influence in there. And there's a lot of people who would still consider it a nunsploitation film. In 1972, Umberto Lenzi's The Man from Deep River kickstarts the cannibal subgenre specifically for Italy. No one makes cannibal films like the Italians, I got to tell you that. Also, 1972, John Waters' Pink Flamingos premieres, merging comedy and shock. Again, that's one where, having known people who saw it either when it premiered or in the few years after, they can tell you the reaction people had, it was a mixture of laughter and horror. 1975, Palasini's Salo, which I would say the most political exploitation film ever made. It is a film that is very unabashedly anti-fascist. Palasini is someone who wore his politics on his sleeve and very likely was killed for it. His murder has never, or death has never really been solved, but most people assume it was politically motivated. That gets released. Salo was a one and done for me. I don't think I'm ever revisiting that one. 1978, Faces of Death, probably the biggest Mondo film of all time. Definitely the one where I think it's the most famous, and it's often referenced, which we'll get to. And in 1979, Caligula's released, probably the most expensive exploitation movie ever made, and starring people like Helen Mirren, Peter O'Toole, Malcolm McDowell, and it's a mess. And I believe maybe it's recouped some of its money eventually, but it hasn't. For all of the trappings and the nice cinematography and the nice sets, the content of that film is pure exploitation. Also in the 70s, we have blaxploitation growing. This is a launch pad for many Black creatives, both behind the camera and in front. In again, as I would call poor taste even for me territory, World War II becomes exploitation fodder with Men Behind the Sun, which is an exploitation film about a Japanese prisoner of war camp. I'll put that in the Still Have and Still Happy file. And then Ilse She-Wolf of the SS, which is an exploitation. Again, Still Have and Still Happy. The 1970s, we also see the rape revenge films enter both the mainstream with Margot Hemingway's Lipstick and I Spit on Your Grave, which is the more, definitely the more exploitation one of the two. Although, if I would say between, I mean, Roger Ebert didn't like either of them, but I would say I Spit on Your Grave's a little more honest versus Lipstick's got some issues where it wants to be a very like feminist film, but again, it's all an execution. So we have both mainstream for that, and then definitely the more exploitation grindhouse theater version of that. We also see this with vigilante films. So we have Charles Bronson in Death Wish, which is probably the most famous vigilante film of the time. And then Last House on the Left, which, Todd, is based on what Ingmar Bergman film?
Easy way to win some bar bets here. It is a 70s remake of Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring.
Ingmar Bergman technically made a rape revenge film, everybody. Who's to say this stuff can't be classy? So again, we find success in the grindhouse theaters and the mainstream. Also, Last House on the Left is Wes Craven, who'd soon be known for Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream. That's his debut. And we are starting to see exploitation on an international level. So we have stuff from Hong Kong with all the martial arts stuff. We have Brazil, which their films are known as the mouth of garbage films, which I love. We have Japan, which I considered covering, but that was one where I'm like, I don't think I can talk about that. Not here. And Italy, which brings me to Italy and exploitation, my favorite little subgenre, or as I like to call it, safety for actors, humane treatment for animals, copyright laws. Nah. 70s and 80s Italian filmmaking was really the height of exploitation, and I've joked that no one does exploitation better than Italy. And the more I joke about it, the more I think I just mean it. They are, the thing that I like about Italian exploitation is they're able to do stuff quickly and cheaply, but it's still watchable, and there's still, I think, some art in there. So you'll have people like Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci who will still manage to have like a really, really, really well composed shots. And actually, the best thing about most Italian exploitation films, they have great soundtracks. So I remember taking film classes and watching stuff like, 8.5 and Bicycle Thieves, and then also learning like, wait, the country that gave me this also gave me this. And, like the high class person I am, I immediately went and be like, I'm going to go watch Zombie. So back in the 80s, especially in like the 70s to 80s in Italy, a great way to get your movie made was to copy a well-known American film. The film Dawn of the Dead was marketed as a Zombie in Italy. So Lucio Fulci's Zombie was literally just called Zombie 2. Um, in Again, if you can't tell, the zombie and the cannibal films really flourished. But they covered a number of different subjects. Crime films. Lucio Fulci directed a crime film called Contraband. War films. So I mentioned it before, The Inglorious Bastards. Science fiction, 1990, The Bronx Warriors. And I'll just say this. I feel like they always remembered first and foremost to have fun, especially in the zombie genre or the science fiction genre. Not so much the cannibal genre. That might be too much for a lot of people. And I get it. If it's not your bag, it's fine. So just a few notable directors: Joe D'Amato, Lucio Fulci, Dino Risi, Bruno Mattei, Umberto Lenzi, and Ruggero Deodato, which we're going to get to him next month, but he directed a fairly well-known film called Cannibal Holocaust. In fact, we might get to that in another slide or two. But first, another for the Exploitation Hall of Fame, Troma. You may have heard of Troma, or you may have seen Toxie, the Toxic Avenger. This was founded in 1974 by Floyd Kaufman and Michael Hers. So both produces and distributes low budget. They do sex comedies, they do horror movies. It's usually the two things they focus on. They tend to focus on horror a lot more, and in the horror community, Troma does have a special place in a lot of people's hearts. I'm unfortunately not one of them. I've given some of their movies a shot. I'm not a fan. I do like what they produce and distribute, or no, I do like what they distribute, but what they produce, I tend to be a little like, not my thing. 1984 is The Toxic Avenger. This is their signature movie, and Toxie is still their mascot. And throughout everything, including kind of the really almost death of exploitation in the 90s, Troma has still kept going, and they are the longest still running independent film studio. So moving on to the 80s, this is where exploitation not quite kicks into high gear, but where we're starting to see it merge into the mainstream. So 1980, we have Friday the 13th. That really brings the slasher genre to the mainstream. We'd had it before with stuff like 1974's Black Christmas. There was also stuff like Maniac, which wasn't as popular, but Friday the 13th brought this to mainstream audiences and really did kind of change this face of horror. I know people might go, well, what about Halloween? And I'm like, Halloween definitely did change the face of horror as well, but in terms of the kills, I'd have to give that to Friday the 13th in terms of just the very in-your-face violence, which if you find makeup effects fascinating, Tom Savini's makeup effects in that movie are amazing. Also in 1980, the aforementioned Cannibal Holocaust is released, and Ruggero Deodato is accused of murdering his actors and animals on screen. Didn't murder his actors, but unfortunately there are some animals that are really killed on screen. Humane Society did not sign off on those movies. 1981, I really want to highlight this one. Abel Ferrara's rape revenge film Miss 45 is released, and this was co-written with its main star. You see there, Zoe Lund. I've been thinking about this a lot because I recently saw Promising Young Women, which I would definitely say is a sharper and better film. But something Miss 45 does, as opposed to a lot of other rape revenge films, is it really is all from her character's perspective. So you see her walking through the streets, you see her getting catcalled, and just people, guys looking at her creepily, a boss who gets a little too close. You see it all from her perspective, and it is completely 100% on her side. A lot of those rape revenge films, they would almost use it as an excuse for nudity, which, again, you wonder why not just use sex, but at that point, sex is almost like it's been done. Miss 45 does not revel in that. Miss 45 is all about the heroine, and I think it is a film that does deserve to be revisited. 1984, we have Angel, schoolgirl by day, hooker by night, literally the tagline of that film. And though blaxploitation was on the downswing and sexploitation had kind of just become either pornography or, nudity just being more accepted in film, the 80s has, again, slashers, it has low budget horror, and it has a lot of Italian production. So a lot of the stuff that Italians made in the late 70s makes its way over here. We also see kind of a not like a side effect of the nudie cuties, we see sex comedies becoming mainstream and definitely are able to push the envelope a little bit more. And so it's not exploitation, but we also see the rise of just low budget filmmaking. So stuff that Corman did back in the 50s and early 60s, that wasn't all exploitation. Some of it was just low budget films, get it in the can. We're starting to see the rise of that again, and a great example of that is John Sayles' Brother from Another Planet. And their companies like the aforementioned Troma, Golden Harvest, and Canon, they kept the trashy goods coming. And with that, we're going to go into the Exploitation Hall of Fame and talk about the Cannon Group. So it was founded in 1967 and it produced Inga. So I told you that would come back. And it's most remembered for the Golan Globus era. And that is when Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, they ran the company from 1979 to 1985. And at one point, I believe it was 1986, they released 40 plus movies in a year. These Cannon Group and that logo, it's pretty much known for the Death Wish sequels and Chuck Norris movies. And it is synonymous with action and exploitation and for the most part a fun time. And Todd, I'm going to give you a few moments just to tell us a little bit more about Cannon.
So besides the points we've already touched on here, chances are if you've ever heard a joke about the infamous sequel subtitle Electric Boogaloo, you've heard of it because of that was a Cannon film, Breakin' 2. Besides that, alongside the two Charleses, which poisoned them for keeping the lights on at Casa del Bronson for as long as they did, they also gave us the famous Ninja trilogy starring Sho Kosugi. And one of the two, I believe was, let me double check, I want to say it was Golan actually gave us he directed a film of his own, the infamous musical The Apple, which that's considered a must on a lot of bad movie lists. And the crazy part is, during all this, they actually did release a few fairly respectable art house type films. Like they did films for Cassavetes, Zeffirelli, Norman Mailer. But those are always remembered in a second to the fact that it was just so much wonderful trash.
Yeah, I of all the distributors, like it's Canon and New World Pictures are the ones where I'm like, oh, I'm in for a fun time.
And fun fact, the last movie they actually made before they went under was a Chuck Norris film.
All right, well, moving on. Unfortunately, with that point, we are going to go into the 90s and kind of the not quite death, because like all trends in cinema and art, it comes back. Does exploitation even exist in the 90s? So by the mid 90s, independent films were around, but they were more stuff like Jim Jarmusch, Richard Linklater's Slacker, and exploitation as it was kind of gone. There was still low budget horror, but it definitely didn't have the qualities of a lot of the stuff that you would see in the early 80s. And again, we still had the action vigilante genre with Charles Bronson's Death Wish 5, The Face of Death, and Troma still existed. We still had some stuff. So in independent movies, they took a turn towards more authentic storytelling. And we have exploitation influencing the mainstream, but once exploitation is influencing the mainstream, what does that mean for exploitation? Exploitation was always seen as something on the fringes, something where it's like, oh, I'm going to see this because I can't get it in a mainstream picture. We did still have a few releases. So there is a film called Traces of Death. It's a Mondo film, comes out in 1993. And there was the videotape trading in the late 80s into the 90s. And those were tapes, either stuff like Todd Haynes' Superstar, which is a Karen Carpenter biopic reenacted with Barbie dolls. I'm not kidding. Or stuff where it was sometimes like, videotapes of real life accidents to get really morbid. But that's kind of what it was at this point. But then there are two, I think, really bright spots that I want to highlight. Quentin Tarantino, who is so obviously influenced by exploitation features, makes his debut in 1992 with Reservoir Dogs, and Robert Rodriguez also makes his debut with El Mariachi, which is inspired by mexploitation films. So we have like little bits, it's clinging to life, but it's still there. So now, 21st century, post 2000s, especially now, we hear like, oh, movies are so violent nowadays, they're so filled with sex. Again, where does exploitation go? We have actually had kind of a renaissance of shocking horror, both at home and abroad. So we have the French New Extreme. We have movies like Martyrs, which I watched Martyrs. I found my limit. I was like, okay, this is where I turn it off. High Tension, Inside. We have torture porn in the US, which is Hostel and Saw, which is kind of the um I'm not really a fan of these movies. Same with Serbian Film and Human Centipede. I almost feel like it's shock for this is going to be me getting on my high horse about exploitation, which is funny in and of itself. But for me, I felt that a lot of the stuff in the 70s with violence was it was really not only testing the boundaries of what can be shown on screen, it was also this idea of, oh, hey, we now have access to, we can film this stuff. It's the democratization of film. Let's try to do what we can to make makeup effects. There was kind of almost this kid in the sandbox freedom and almost an honesty because they were like, look, we're literally just trying to do what we can to shock versus the movies like Hostel and Saw almost seem like they're trying to have a morality thing to it. And I think I'm just kind of like, get that morality stuff out of here. Either be 1930s Reefer Madness or not. So yeah, not a huge fan of the Hostel and Saw stuff. I say give me the wanton violence of a Lucio Fulci movie any day. There's also a Serbian film, which that was another one where it did absolutely everything it could to shock and pretty much didn't become a cult classic. It just became a novelty. And same with Human Centipede. On the more interesting end, we have filmmakers like Gaspar Noé and Catherine Breillat, who I discussed last month. They'll make films that will shock and challenge audiences. There's definitely not even traces, but definite seeds of exploitation in there, but they will also genuinely try to make something. They'll make it a piece of art or they'll make you try to make you think. Catherine Breillat's Fat Girl is an incredibly shocking and upsetting film, but it also, I think, says some really true and terrifyingly true things about how young girls navigate sexuality. And then we also have Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez. They make Grindhouse in 2007, which was a double feature film and unfortunately didn't do too well at the box office. If only they'd waited, because now everyone will sit for like a 3-hour movie. But Grindhouse is actually a lot of fun. You have Planet Terror, which is a take on a zombie film, and then you have Death Proof, which is a take on a road movie. And you have these fake trailers. So Rob Zombie did a fake trailer for a Notsploitation film. Edgar Wright did an old Hammer tribute trailer. And actually, this is where we got the first instance of Machete, which is Robert Rodriguez's other tribute to the Mexploitation genre. In 2009, definitely a great hidden treasure film if you haven't seen it. Black Dynamite is a blaxploitation tribute, and if you've not seen that movie, I would recommend it. It is a great tribute to that genre and just a lot of fun in its own right. So, remember how I said exploitation really hasn't influenced cinema that much? Well, we hopefully I've kind of shown you that we're starting to see some of it in more modern filmmaking, but exploitation actually gave us a lot of a couple of directors and actors got their start. Abel Ferreira got his start. Same with Jonathan Demme. I think his first one was Caged Heat. Jack Nicholson worked with Roger Corman. He, I believe, his debut, or at least his first big film, was Little Shop of Horrors. We also had Jim Brown and Pam Grier, who definitely made careers in blaxploitation film. And again, Last House on the Left is a film that was, I think, widely dismissed when it came out, with a few defenders, Roger Ebert being one of them, as just trash. Last House on the Left has been reevaluated and is definitely seen more now as a far more daring and transgressive piece than when it came out. And again, look at Quentin Tarantino. I don't know if that man would be making movies if exploitation had never happened. I don't know what his life would be like. I mean, if you look at every single one of his films, you can see what subgenre they're influenced by. Kill Bill is martial arts, or Kill Bill Volume 1 is martial arts film and some shempsploitation. Kill Bill Volume 2 is spaghetti westerns and just the more exploitation westerns. Inglourious Bastards is the Italian war movies. Jackie Brown, blaxploitation. Django, blaxploitation and kind of Civil War exploitation. Also, just a minor sticking point. I really wish people would stop saying that Tarantino was ripping these things off when he has been very vocal and upfront about what his influences are. But I mean, I think if there's one filmmaker who's truly been influenced by exploitation, it would be Quentin Tarantino. Maybe that's why I love him. And we'll see that exploitation exists between the line of art and just utter trash. So Lucio Fulci, I think, is someone who is a very talented filmmaker. He has an eye for style. He has an eye for set design. But a lot of his movies, I wouldn't say have a lot of great story. Or Abel Ferrara is someone like that as well. Modern directors, Gaspar Noé, Lars von Trier, and Darren Aronofsky are three that I would say definitely have exploitation influences. And with that, we're going to discuss three films I think that have a lot of exploitation influence in them. The first being Darren Aronofsky's Mother. I don't know if anyone saw this. It fairly infamously came into theaters in 2017 and was an incredibly divisive film. It's a film that is both a lot of religious overtones and religious allegories, and also overall trying to be kind of a climate change allegory. I think it's brilliant. It doesn't all come together, but I appreciate the audacity. There is also just a general air of horror, and the third act of that film is bananas. The house that they live in transforms from a regular house to this just ever morphing landscape where there's bombs going off, there's executions, there's parties. It's a real ride. But in the final 20 minutes of that film, and I saw this in a theater, something happens in there. This is where I would say potentially, if you don't want to hear about something awful happening, you might want to leave. To Todd, what did you say? Jonathan Swiftian might be a good way to describe it.
Probably the most tasteful way to put it.
Yeah, I still don't, yeah, I still don't know how to quite describe what happens, but let's just say echoes Jonathan Swift if you're familiar with The Modest Proposal, and it's also supposed to be kind of an allegory for communion if you're Catholic. There was some, I mean, my first thought in theaters is, how did this happen? How did any studio allow this? Because it also made me think of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. There's something in there that's so shocking that even the guy who adapted it's like, I'm not putting this on screen. But then it made me think of a Joe D'Amato film, Anthropophagic. I can never say this word. I'll just call it by the US title, The Grim Reaper, where I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that reading about there is a scene where something similar happens and just going, well, look at Darren Aronofsky making this high art film with all these ideas and still kind of going into a really deep well exploitation trick to shock his audience. Mother, like a lot of things, not for everybody. I would say check it out, but totally understand if you don't. And up next is The Night Porter. So I was wondering whether to discuss this or Palacini's Salo for a film that really blurs the line between an exploitation film and an art film. But at the end of the day, the stuff that happens in Salo, it's so clearly meant to shock. It's so clearly exploitation. I'm like, I think I feel comfortable putting it in that camp. The Night Porter is one I saw 10 years ago. I'm still not sure what I think about it. I don't know if I'll ever watch it again. I mean, look at the plot description. This is, post-war Europe, a concentration camp survivor and a former SS officer. They meet at a hotel and they recreate the relationship they had at the camp. So he protected her, but, of course, the power dynamic in that situation is like, can this even be consenting? It is an incredibly bleak film. I've always considered Notsploitation to be a fairly, again, that's poor taste even for me. I have no problem with people making films about war or awful offense, but I do think it's incredibly tasteless to mine that for something salacious. I don't think this film really kind of wallows in trying to make it salacious or lurid. I mean, there's nothing really sexy in this film. It's all horrifying. But just the very nature of this idea is something that's so shocking. It was decried as an exploitation film, and many people do consider it. They're like, this is just a classy Notsploitation feature. And again, I'm still not sure where I'd put it. The only thing I can be sure of is, well, I don't think I'll ever revisit this film. I don't think I'll ever forget it. I just wanted to leave this quote by Annette Isdorf. She's written at length about the Holocaust in film, and she says The Night Porter is provocative and problematic. Made in 1974, it can be seen as an exercise in perversion and exploitation of the Holocaust for the sake of sensationalism. On the other hand, a closer reading of this English language psychological thriller suggests a dark vision of compelling characters doomed by their World War II past. Again, this is one where I would say if you would like to seek it out, it's definitely, I don't think I would consider it full on exploitation, but it is a film that truly, to my core, made me uncomfortable. So our final film, we're going to lighten it up a bit. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, or as I would call it, the ultimate mainstream exploitation film, or at least the ultimate example of exploitation tropes in a mainstream feature. So I think we all know about Indiana Jones. I'd hope we all do. 3 great films. You heard me, 3. We're not talking about, there's supposedly a 4th movie exists. I don't buy that. So this was a series that was a tribute to 30 serials and kind of the more pulpy storylines of the time. And pulp is, I think in many ways, kind of it's an offshoot or tangentially related to exploitation. So things that we see in Indiana Jones, The Temple of Doom. You have the dinner scene where people are eating chilled monkey brains. That is, I am sure, a direct callback to something that does supposedly really happen. I think that was all faked in Faces of Death. You have these ancient cult rituals. You'd see that in Mondo Cane. You have hearts getting ripped out. Any Italian horror movie made at that time. You have the over-the-top stereotypes, which you find in pulp, exploitation, just general older films. It's all, there's also the influence, like the 50s and early 60s, there was a fascination with India. There was a fascination with Africa. You have movies like Gunga Din, The Naked Prey, which Naked Prey is a great film. But it is all a callback to an older type of film, but it also, and again, this is famously the movie that a lot of people were like, maybe we need something between PG and R. But I think based on what we're seeing, I'm like, this is, I almost want to blame this movie for getting me into exploitation because I'm like, oh, I was primed at 8 when I saw this. And it's also a lot of fun. I mean, it starts with the musical number. I've often described Indiana Jones as my favorite Indiana Jones film because it includes peak hot Harrison Ford, exploitation level violence, and it's got a musical number. I mean, what more do you want? So just some further reading and viewing. I did say Big Bosoms and Square Jaws. That's the Russ Meyer biography. The Canon Film Guide for 80 to 84, if you really want to get into that. For documentaries, I would like to give a shout out to the Exploit This. So it hasn't been made yet, but one of my Camp John Waters buddies, he just finished his Kickstarter for it. So it is going to be coming out soon. Give a shout out to my Camp John Waters buddy. So if you are interested in it, that would be a good one to check out. The 2 ones on Canon Films are a lot of fun. Just really anything involving Canon Films it's a fun time. And before we get to questions, we're going to have a little scene with Ashley St. Ives.
Paris, you're drunk, stoned, and the worst of it is, you're a lousy lay. You'll never get into one of my films, sweetheart, unless maybe as a hairdresser. What do you mean? Kinda to tell you now, lover. Maybe it's not too late for you to find some nice, tender boy.
No wonder Russ Meyer married her. Alrighty, so question time, or as I say, unless you're going to ask why do I like this, because I love garbage. That's why. Oops, so I'm going to stop sharing at this point.
So we did have a question in the chat, actually. So
okay. Oh, so I saw someone giving Grindhouse a shout out with the Chick Habit, which thumbs up. What was the question?
if you scroll up a little, it was kind of questioning as far as whether certain films could be considered of the particular exploitation types, which the 3 examples given were Schindler's List as non-exploitation, Doubt as non-exploitation, and Black Klansman as black exploitation.
Black Klansman, I think Spike Lee specifically did want to have some references to it.
There, there is literally a scene in the film kind of discussing its impacts.
Yeah, discussing its impact. There's definitely some like musical cues that they'll do. Todd and I have had this discussion about like, is potentially every war film exploitation in some way, shape, or form, because it's obviously going on something that has, a lot of emotional resonance for people. Potentially, it might not make people happy. Doubt is nunsploitation. Ooh, that's an interesting one. I do love that play, and I think the film is a good adaptation of it. I'm not sure. I think usually when I think of nunsploitation, I think it's usually a nun kind of figuring out she doesn't want to quite be a nun. She kind of has temptations, versus doubt is more a nun trying to do the right thing, and it's more of a mystery. But there has been the discussion. I think in it, Isadore, she's written about the Holocaust on film. She might be someone to look up to, or not look up to, but look up in terms of if films that feature the Holocaust are inherently kind of exploitative. Again, that's not a question I feel like I'm super duper qualified to answer. So I will refer to someone who probably knows more than me. Klansman, that's an interesting one, because Spike Lee said he was inspired by it. There's definitely some callbacks. And if you've seen the end of BlacKkKlansman, there were some people who accused using the raw footage of the Charlottesville rally and that car running into that group of protesters as exploitative. I do just want to say, I did look into that. Spike Lee did get Heather Heyer's mother's and her family's okay to utilize it. He's like, I think I have to end it this way. But still, like, you don't use that without knowing this is going to cause an emotional reaction. However, art in and of itself is about having an emotional reaction. So again, it's that line of like, how much of this is trying to invoke an emotional response and how much of it is exploiting. And potentially that might be something that is in the eye of the viewer. Because there are some films I'm like, again, I look at Freaks and I'm like, I don't think that's exploitation. I have read other people who, completely would disagree with that. But again, I think that's probably why I find the genre so fascinating, because it's the blur, not even the hard and fast binary, it's the blurred line, especially as we have, as we've seen it influence modern film. Oh, there's another message. Voices of gore and gruesome twosome. Oops. Why can I not read these things? Oh, Herschel Gordon Lewis. Okay.
Speaking of, heads up, I may be putting on some Fulci after this.
Oh, I gotta go to bed. Can't do that. Does anyone else have any other questions? Anyone want to ask about Japan and why I can't talk about it that much? Art has been mentioned as being exploitative prior to movies. What a great example relating to art. There is that, I think any depiction of hell. Unfortunately, yeah, I did not get a degree in fine art for obvious reasons. But any depiction of hell, there are plenty of artistic renderings of hell that are very frightening, very scary. There's the picture, Todd, you might know, Dante's Inferno. Yes, I don't know why that one escaped me, but I think you could even argue that some depictions of the crucifixion could fall
into. Yeah.
Or like a lot of books. Like probably not exploitation as we would consider it now, but definitely like the cautionary tales. You could probably consider that. And there's stuff like maybe Tale of Genji, considered the world's first novel, actually written by Lady Murasaki. Definitely a lot of romantic tales in that. So kind of be like, well, there's no other way we can get this sort of stuff in our lives. Again, that's an interesting question. I definitely can think of a few like art as in, visual art examples. And yeah, I definitely I think some Like, Todd, what do you think about like Charles Dickens? Do you think any of his work falls into kind of exploitation, or at the very least the morality tail end of it?
Kind of on the morality tail end of it. I mean, again, part of it goes in that weird, almost cultural fetishization of orphans, but that's a topic for a whole other time.
Ooh, good question. Can a town be considered exploitative like Salem? Salem's an interesting case because while you have Samantha there, I do think Salem, especially in more recent years, has really tried to own its past and not make it cartoony. There's actually, I will recommend a good film about this. It is a children's film technically, but I think it deals with it very well. And that is the Leica film Paranorman. It takes place in a film that pretty much is Salem, Mass, and kind of how this, what turns out to be a fairly horrific tale of a witch being executed, is kind of morphed into something cutesy and fun. And it's all fun and games until the witch rises one night. But Salem, I think in the more recent years has really been trying to reckon with, like, yes, we had multiple people executed here for no reason, and it actually is horrifying rather than something that you can put your head in, a little witch cutout. Salem's an interesting case. I mean, but I think that's something a lot of towns and places are trying to deal with right now, is the more like, oh, we need to really take a look at our past right now. Any other questions? Well, hopefully I haven't scared you away from some movies, but I would just say, again, a lot of the new modern, like very violence-heavy horror, like the stuff that came out in the aughts, I'm Team Nah on that. But if you would like to look for something that might be, a good in the middle, Dario Argento's Suspiria is great. I mean, I would just consider that to be an art film, but there's definitely the highly stylized killings that you see in a lot of stuff. Oh god, what else would I recommend that would be great? Again, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls it's a weird watch, but it's a lot of fun. And hey, Todd, is 10 to Midnight still on HBO Max? Because that's a great, that's a.
I do believe it is, but let me confirm really quick.
Yeah, I would say those are.
That is like a textbook canon film right there.
Yeah. Again, if you want something that's safe to watch and you're pretty sure you're not going to get anything too, like, over the edge, I would say anything that Canon put out in the 80s is safe.
So it looks like it might still be up there.
All right, 10 to midnight. 10 to midnight on HBO Max. I mean, is Charles Bronson ever a bad idea? I don't think so. All righty. Well,
I got nothing there.
If that is the case, I'll thank everyone for coming, and hopefully I'll see you all next month with It's a Disaster.
Thanks, Liz. It was great.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too. Thanks.